Clint Eastwood changed Hollywood not only with his movies, but with his star power. January 7th was my first day of class with Professor Rich Cheatham for the class called Films of Clint Eastwood. Professor Cheatham had gone to USC and his PhD dissertation was on star power, specifically in relation to Clint Eastwood, so he was a fountain of knowledge when it came to that topic. He could talk about any of his films in depth at the drop of a hat, and how that film had affected both Eastwood's career and Hollywood in general. Now, I know some of you are watching for the filmmaking lessons, but some of you are just here for the college stories. So I'll give you a breakdown of this class, and then there'll be a story time about the infamous college freshman, 3 Beers. But this was a fascinating class for me because Clint Eastwood had been mayor of Carmel, and my dad had gone to Carmel High School and had first interacted with him all the way back in 1968. My dad went on to wait on Eastwood in a restaurant a few years later, and it was a restaurant that deducted 10% of the bill from the waiter's salary, which, if you didn't know, was a practice that happened in many restaurants prior to Labor Code 351, which, to quickly summarize, states that employers can't deduct any part of an employee's tips and have to treat tips as the employee's property. But this was before that law was passed, so when Clint Eastwood ordered $300 worth of food and drinks at this restaurant, got drunk, and left exactly $300 with no tip, $30 was deducted from my dad's wages. It had actually cost my dad money to wait on him. So growing up, I didn't really hear anything good about Clint Eastwood, but this class showed me his career rather than his personal or political life, and it was fascinating in ways I never expected. For those who don't know, Eastwood got started in a TV show called Rawhide, and he was in all 217 episodes. And then he moved on to shooting country western films in Italy because it was cheaper than shooting in Hollywood, films that became known as spaghetti westerns. Clint Eastwood's star persona aged and matured over the years, causing his films to be analyzed and criticized in different ways throughout his career as both an actor and director. The class I took focused on the critical analysis of Clint Eastwood's films by exploring his star persona and its evolution throughout his career, the differing audience reactions to his films between the people and the critics, and exploring the recurring themes of revenge, vigilante justice, and the restoration of a cynic, among other themes that appear time and time again throughout Eastwood's films. What I learned was that those films evolved significantly over the years. For example, Clint Eastwood's portrayal of violence and murder changes drastically from High Plains Drifter in 1973 to Unforgiven in 1992. In High Plains Drifter, violence was the perfect means of revenge, the bodies of the murdered forgotten on a dusty road. But by the time of Unforgiven, violence had changed to be something shameful, to be buried in the past, and murder had become a complicated, difficult task that was never quick and painless for anyone involved in the deed. I saw the characters Mr. Eastwood played develop from uncaring, detached vigilantes that would shoot at the drop of a hat in cheap spaghetti westerns, to caring men who will accept humiliation without fighting back in order to save a friend from prison in huge Hollywood productions. This change over the years has sparked recognition from the critics, continued love by the fans, and a general improving appreciation of Eastwood as both an actor and director. He managed to throw off the claims of racism, sexism, and pure brutality to show audiences that he had a heart underneath the man with no name character. A heart which would show through in the movie Bronco Billy in 1980 more than any film he'd made up until that point. People's thoughts about him continued to change as they took on projects that talked more about how experience trumps youthful enthusiasm, with films like $1 Million Baby and 2008's famous film Gran Torino. Throughout his career, Clint Eastwood evolved from a man who barely spoke in his films and was seen as wooden, to a man who not only satirizes his previous characters in his films, but also flies in the face of the accusations of sexism and racism that had haunted him for years. And Hollywood took note of that, and many filmmakers made similar films to what he was working on at the time after he showed them that, for example, westerns could still be profitable in the 1990s, or that there was a market for 5 movies about a cop who doesn't play by the rules, the Dirty Harry series. The big lesson I learned in that class is that star power can change one career path or the whole industry. All right, now it's story time. Remember when I mentioned things you do early on in college can get you nicknames that last for years? Well, you've heard about shark bait, but it's time I told you about 3 beers. To start off the night, a friend and I went to Klamer's room, who I'm sure you remember from season 3, episodes 12 and 18. That room was called a quad because it was one of the few rooms in Stauffer with 4 people in it. And those 4 people were Klamer, Nick Stanton, who you might recognize from season 3, episodes 13 and 18, another freshman that we'll call the W Dog, and 3 beers. But 2 women, my friend and I, had all ended up in the dorm room with Klamer and Nick Stanton, while the W Dog and 3 beers were out. 3 beers had gotten the nickname because he drank, you guessed it, 3 beers at one of his first college parties, and had somehow gotten extremely drunk off of those 3 beers, stumbled around the party, and threw up everywhere. No one had ever let him forget how low his tolerance for alcohol had been and what he had done, and the name had stuck. But that night, a couple of the people in that room took shots of Grant's blended Scotch whiskey, which is 80 proof, and Klamer laid down on the desk in the center of the room. I took a photo at 9:38 p.m. that night, and by then Klamer was passed out face down on the desk. And then one of the women said, "Let's do a line off of Klamer." We all laughed at the joke, but then to our surprise, she pulled out a small plastic baggie with cocaine in it, crushed a little bit of it, smoothed out Klamer's shirt, poured 2 lines onto his back and lined him up with her student ID, and then each of the 2 women did a line off of Klamer. Now, as freshmen in college, this was the first time about half the people in the room had ever seen cocaine in real life, including me, so we were a little shocked, but, we did our best to keep our cool. Klamer woke up a few minutes later, having no idea that he'd become a surface for drug use, and decided it would be a great idea to 360 degrees saran wrap 3 beers his bunk bed, so he'd have to cut through it in order to lay down. And we spent the next half hour using the entirety of a roll of saran wrap to do just that. Klamer had to tell us about it the next day, but that night when 3 beers got back to the room, most likely wasted off of less than 4 Coronas, the lights were already off and he went to lie down on his bed. He bounced right off the saran wrap, landed on the floor, and yelled out, Was that a force field? Apparently, he spent the next 10 minutes trying to figure out what was going on and to unwrap his bed, at one point even trying to bite through it. But you'll have to tune in next week for a much crazier college story.